was supposed to be ordinary, just another cold courtroom, just another quiet hearing. No cameras, no headlines. But when he appeared, tall, silent, black, the kind of presence that made people straighten in their chairs without knowing why, something shifted. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. It was what gleamed on his chest that unsettled them. Not because it was bright, but because it meant someone like him had survived what others didn't, and carried it into a place that wasn't ready to look him in the eye. The judge's order came fast, sharp, meant to humiliate. But what followed didn't go as planned. The silence didn't obey. The walls didn't hold. And the man everyone tried to overlook became the name no one could forget. This isn't just a story about a medal. It's about what happens when a system tries to silence the wrong man and learns too late who he really is. If that pulled you in, subscribe for more, hit like, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what part hit you hardest? We're listening. The courtroom froze in collective disbelief. The judge's demand landing with a weight that pressed down on everyone present. The air shifted, no longer neutral, but electric with tension and discomfort. At the center of the chamber stood Sergeant Thomas Reeve, unmoved, unshaken, carved from the kind of discipline born only through years of loss, duty, and silence. His eyes remained forward, his spine unyielding, his white-gloved hands resting at his sides. That medal, pinned squarely above his heart, was not simply an adornment. It was a piece of memory, of blood spilled and brothers buried. It was not about him. It never had been. And yet, in that moment, Merrick had turned it into something profane. A violation, a target. Judge Merrick, dressed in his flowing black robe, leaned over the bench with all the weight of institutional arrogance, unbothered by the silence his outburst had created. He didn't see Reeve for what he was, a man honoring fallen friends, only a symbol he didn't understand, one that disrupted the neat control of his courtroom. "This isn't a memorial service," he continued, his voice less bark now and more condescension. "You are not here in any official capacity. That medal may be meaningful to you, but in this setting, it's inappropriate. Remove it immediately." Thomas didn't move. His stillness wasn't defiance, but something deeper, an echo of all the funerals he had stood through without flinching, of every flag he had folded, every silence he had kept. His body may have been in a courtroom, but his soul was elsewhere, in the heat of foreign soil, in the hum of rotors over sand, in the whispered last words of dying men who called him brother. In the front row, Sarah McConnell's head dipped slightly, her eyes wide with disbelief and pain. Her son clutched the sleeve of her dress, too young to understand the full gravity, but old enough to feel its wrongness. They had come here today seeking justice, not spectacle. But Merrick had turned it into one. Reeve didn't look at them. He couldn't. To do so would break the last barrier holding his grief in place. Around the room, subtle reactions flared like sparks in dry grass. A veteran near the back clenched his jaw. A woman dabbed at her eyes. Even the bailiff, a man used to enforcing order without question, looked to the judge with a flicker of unease. Still, no one spoke. No one stood. That silence, Reeve thought, was the most familiar sound in the world. The silence after an IED blast. The silence of an empty bunk. The silence of families receiving folded flags. He had carried that silence with him from battlefield to battlefield. And now here it was again, hanging heavy in the air of an American courtroom. Judge Merrick tapped his gavel once, sharply, more for effect than necessity. "I won't repeat myself again," he said. "Remove the insignia or I will have you removed." The word insignia stabbed deeper than it should have. That wasn't an insignia. It was a nameplate etched in the memory of every soldier who hadn't come home. But Merrick didn't care. He didn't ask what the medal meant. He didn't care who had died to earn it. He saw only disruption. Reeve inhaled slowly, deeply, and reached up with steady fingers. His gloved hand touched the ribbon. He paused, not from hesitation, but reverence. Then, in one smooth motion, he unclasped the medal and removed it. The medal felt cold against his palm. The ribbon folded into itself. 1,000 memories flooded forward in the blink of an eye. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink. He remained frozen in place, the sounds of legal arguments dull and distant in his ears, as though he'd been thrust underwater. His hand remained closed over the Medal of Honor, the ribbon crumpled beneath his fingers, the weight of it somehow heavier now that it was hidden from view. He had followed the order. He had complied, not because the judge deserved his obedience, but because Sarah McConnell deserved the chance to be heard without distraction, without scandal. Reeve had made a choice, dignity over defiance, but the bitterness of that decision lingered, a metallic taste in the back of his throat. His eyes locked forward, unblinking, as Sarah's attorney began to present the case. Her husband, Corporal Danny McConnell, had been injured during a mission where paperwork hadn't survived the chaos, and the VA had used that absence as an excuse to deny her claim. It wasn't just wrong, it was cowardly. Thomas knew what happened that day. He had carried Danny's body himself, through enemy fire, across terrain soaked in dust and blood. No citation could fully explain the sacrifice, and no policy loophole should have erased the evidence written in pain and silence. The judge didn't see it that way. Judge Merrick sat with one elbow propped on his bench, fingers drumming the arm of his chair, while Sarah's lawyer listed timelines, deployment dates, and fragments of communication logs. Merrick's eyes were on the documents, but his thoughts seemed far away. He barely reacted to anything said, as if he had already decided the case before stepping into the room. Reeve's muscles tensed. Every second he sat there, the humiliation throbbed like a bruise on his pride. He wasn't angry, yet. He was wounded, disappointed, disillusioned. This courtroom wasn't a place of justice today. It was a theater, and he had been forced into the role of pariah. The people around him sat uncomfortably. Some looked at him from the corners of their eyes. Some avoided him entirely. The veterans in the gallery, silent, stoic, burdened with their own ghosts, had said nothing when the order came down. Maybe they were afraid of drawing attention. Maybe they were trying to respect the process. But their silence had felt like a betrayal, even if he understood it. Across the aisle, Sarah clutched a tissue in her hand, dabbing beneath her eye as her lawyer pressed forward. She hadn't looked at Thomas since he sat down. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she was holding herself together by ignoring the weight of what had just happened. Her son sat still, quiet, knees pulled to the edge of his chair. He didn't speak. He didn't fidget. He simply leaned against his mother's arm and stared down at the floor with the gravity of a child who knew too much. Thomas looked at the boy for a long second. There was something piercing about his stillness. Danny's eyes had always hardened like that in firefights, sharp and clear when everything went to hell. That boy had his father's courage, but he shouldn't have to carry his father's battle. That was Thomas's job. That's why he had come. That's why he had stood tall in his uniform. Why he had worn the medal. To remind the court, without words, that sacrifice mattered. And in one sentence, Merrick had ripped that purpose from him. Removed that decoration. Reeve had followed the order, but that didn't mean the fight was over. The courtroom might have moved on, but something inside Thomas hadn't. He felt it pressing against his ribs, the memory of a firefight in a dry valley where they waited too long for medevac, where Danny bled out with his hand in Thomas's. That was what the medal meant. Not honor, not glory, memory. And Merrick had tried to strip it away as if it were theater, a performance. That cut deep. The government attorney began to speak, his voice smooth and practiced, detailing how the denial was due to a missing verification of combat circumstances. Standard procedure, he said. Without a validated incident report or official citation, the claim cannot meet the threshold for posthumous benefits. Reeve gritted his teeth. That phrase, standard procedure, had become a shield for cowardice. He had lived the incident. He had watched Danny die. And now the hearing was slipping into another phase, cold and procedural, as if none of it mattered, as if the insult to honor had been nothing more than a footnote. Yet inside Thomas, something had shifted. Not in posture, he still sat rigid, composed, but in pressure, in weight, in the silence between his breaths. Sarah's lawyer was still speaking, methodically countering the government's rejection of Corporal McConnell's death benefits, laying out the truth with documents, photos, and sworn statements. But Merrick looked bored. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't making notes. He was tolerating the proceedings, waiting for them to end so he could dismiss the case and move on. Thomas could see it in his eyes, that subtle impatience, that practiced indifference of a man who believed procedure mattered more than people. Every second Thomas remained seated felt like a test, not just of patience, but of purpose. The very reason he wore the medal, to honor the silent, to protect the memory of the lost, had been called into question, made to look excessive, even inappropriate. And the room had accepted it. That acceptance stung worse than Merrick's voice. It was the silence of complicity, the inaction of people who knew better but said nothing. And yet Thomas remained still, not because he agreed, because he had given Sarah his word. This was her moment, her fight, and she needed the court to see her husband as more than a file. Even now, she kept her chin up, her voice steady, her emotions tightly controlled. Her son sat beside her, small and silent, watching everything, understanding more than a child ever should. Reeve knew that look. He had seen it in villages where war had taken fathers and left sons hollow-eyed. And now he saw it again, in the heart of America, in a courtroom where justice was supposed to mean something. Merrick finally leaned forward, tapping his pen against the desk. "Is there anyone here who can verify the account described in the supplemental affidavit?" he asked. The government attorney shook his head. No formal field report was submitted. No commanding officer's testimony has been included in the appeal file. Merrick nodded slowly, already forming the words of dismissal in his mind. Then, for reasons Thomas couldn't explain, the judge's eyes flicked toward him again. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was provocation. "Sergeant Reeve," Merrick said, his tone measured but faintly condescending. "You seem to have some familiarity with the events described. Were you present during the incident in question?" Thomas didn't move at first. He knew the trap. The judge wasn't inviting him to speak out of fairness. This was control, re-establishing dominance. Thomas had already been silenced, and now Merrick was offering a chance to speak, on his terms, within limits, under scrutiny. Slowly, Thomas stood. His movement was deliberate, not to challenge, but to affirm. He wasn't a man rushing to the defense. He was a man stepping into it with the same composure he'd used when walking through open fire to retrieve a dying friend. "I was there," he said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It carried across the courtroom with simple authority. "I was the one who pulled Danny McConnell out after he was hit." Merrick's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did you submit any incident report to confirm your statement?" Thomas shook his head once. "There wasn't time to write a report, Your Honor. We were under attack. I sent a body home, not paperwork." A ripple moved through the gallery. It wasn't a sound, but a shift in energy. Veterans sitting taller, civilians glancing at one another, the bailiff pausing mid-step. Merrick's pen stopped moving. He stared at Reeve, not liking the answer, but unable to argue with it. "That may be," the judge replied slowly, "but the record doesn't reflect that version of events." The courtroom wasn't supposed to be a battlefield, but in that moment it became one, and Merrick didn't like the fact that he wasn't in full control of it. He leaned forward over his bench, his voice low but stern, clipped with calculated authority. "Sergeant Reeve," he said, "I will remind you that this is a legal proceeding, not a platform for unsolicited opinion. I allowed your statement as a courtesy, but if you continue to speak without being addressed, I will hold you in contempt of court." The threat wasn't shouted. It was delivered like a final warning, wrapped in the tone of a man used to obedience. But it echoed far louder than any outburst would have. The gallery reacted as one, not with gasps or voices, but with motion, small but significant. An elderly veteran in the back shifted his weight forward, his hand tightening around a wooden cane decorated with faded campaign stickers. A young man in a Marine Corps dress jacket folded his arms, his jaw flexing. A woman in civilian clothes reached instinctively for a pendant around her neck, dog tags. None of them spoke. None of them stood. But the silence that followed Merrick's threat was no longer passive. It had become its own form of protest. Loaded, bracing, waiting. Reeve remained standing, eyes locked on Merrick with the same calmness that had carried him through firefights. His fist didn't clench. His voice didn't rise. "Understood, Your Honor," he said, each syllable quiet, deliberate, and soaked in restraint. "I've said all I came to say." But the damage had already been done, not by Reeve, but by the threat itself. The judge had just told a decorated soldier, a man who had endured more than most in that room could comprehend, that truth was unwelcome if it disrupted procedure. That reality had no place here if it didn't fit in the proper box. Merrick didn't see the implications. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't care. He turned his attention back to Sarah's lawyer, who, to his credit, stood firm despite the hostility in the room. The attorney adjusted his tie and continued his case, clearly rattled but pressing on, knowing this wasn't just a legal matter anymore. It was something larger, something symbolic. Sarah sat with her hands clasped tightly, her knuckles pale. She had heard Reeve's testimony, had watched him take a blow and respond with dignity. Her son looked up at her, confused and concerned, but she offered him a soft smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. She was grateful, that much was clear. But she was also exhausted, and she understood now, in a way that even Reeve had feared, that this judge would not yield, that this court had no interest in empathy or truth, only in rules and resistance to challenge. Behind Reeve, more movement. The older veteran with the cane placed it against the seat beside him and rested both hands on his knees. He didn't stand, not yet, but his intent had shifted. Others noticed. There was tension now, a collective holding of breath. No one had the authority to speak, but everyone knew that something wasn't right. The courtroom had become a powder keg of reverence and restrained indignation. Merrick pressed forward as though nothing had happened. He spoke quickly now, trying to move the hearing along, citing procedural law, reviewing statutes, asking rhetorical questions the government's counsel could easily answer. He avoided eye contact with Reeve. He addressed Sarah and her attorney with clipped efficiency. The humanity had drained from his tone, replaced with the cold efficiency of a man trying to wrest back control. And yet, the courtroom had shifted, whether he accepted it or not. Reeve returned to his seat, slowly, purposefully, the metal still in his closed hand. He didn't look down. He didn't speak. He sat like a man carved in stone, unmoving, unreadable, but undeniably present. The judge might have tried to silence him, but everyone in the room had heard his words, and they lingered. They vibrated in the air like echoes in a canyon, impossible to ignore. The legal conversation continued, but no one listened with full attention. The threat still hung there, unspoken yet palpable. Merrick had made it clear, comply or be punished. Not just legally, but symbolically. Reeve's presence, his medal, his sacrifice, all of it was secondary to the order of the court. The judge might have felt victorious, but the silence he demanded was no longer his to control. Merrick's gaze, cold and clinical, swept back to the bench as Sarah's attorney continued to outline combat details and timeline inconsistencies, laying out the logic of the benefits claim with patience that came only from experience battling a bureaucracy that had no memory and no heart. But despite his efforts, despite every fact on paper, the atmosphere had shifted, pulled like a tide toward something deeper, toward truth that lived outside of forms and formalities. Sergeant Reeve sat silent again, his uniform crisp, his back straight, his fists clenched around the metal that should never have left his chest. His calm hadn't broken, his voice hadn't risen, but the heat of his restraint radiated through the rows behind him, quietly igniting the men and women who knew exactly what he felt. For minutes, nothing happened. The judge pushed forward, calling attention back to the legal mechanics of the case, asking questions meant to drain emotion from the conversation. He failed, because from the back of the gallery, a sound finally broke through, not loud, but resonant, a chair scraping gently against the polished floor. Every head turned. Standing slowly, deliberately, was a man clearly not young, his posture worn from decades of service, but his presence commanding all the same. His navy dress blues were faded, the edges softened from years of ceremonial wear. His silver hair was combed back, and his eyes, sharp despite age, locked on Judge Merrick with the steadiness of someone who had spent his life under command, but knew when silence became complicity. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice firm, clear, not angry but certain. "I served 28 years, active duty Navy. I have buried friends in 4 countries. I have folded flags for families who couldn't speak through their grief." That man, he said, nodding toward Reeve, earned that medal not because someone thought it looked good on a uniform, but because he stood between danger and those who couldn't escape it. You call it a pin. I call it promise. The courtroom stilled. Merrick, visibly stiffening, tried to speak, but the man continued without raising his volume. He didn't speak out of turn. He didn't seek attention. He stood quietly, honoring a brother in arms. And you tried to strip him of that. The man's hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from intensity. He turned briefly toward the gallery, where others now sat straighter, veterans recognizing one of their own stepping into the line of fire, not with a rifle, but with reverence. A murmur swept through the seats, not chaotic, but unified. Small nods, whispers of agreement, eyes locking with Reeves for the first time. There was no shout, no protest, just the slow, growing realization that what had been done wasn't just wrong, it was dishonorable. Merrick banged his gavel. Once, twice. "Order," he said, his voice louder than before. "Sit down, sir, or I'll have you removed from the courtroom." But the man didn't sit. Instead, he turned back toward Merrick and raised his voice by a single decibel. "If honor is not welcome in this courtroom, then perhaps the court no longer serves the people it claims to represent." The judge's face flushed. "That's enough. Bailiff," he began, gesturing to his left. But the bailiff hadn't moved. His eyes, too, were locked on the old veteran. Reeve remained seated, but his eyes flicked up, scanning the room, watching a ripple of something spread. Not rebellion, but restoration. Something long overdue. Sarah turned slowly, her eyes wide as she looked back at the man speaking. For the first time since the medal had come off Reeve's chest, her hand reached for her son's shoulder, a quiet gesture of comfort, of grounding, of hope. Merrick stood now, no longer hiding his discomfort. "This is a legal hearing, not a military forum. Sit down now or face removal." But even as he spoke, 2 more people stood in the gallery. Then a third. Veterans, civilians, a woman in a nurse's uniform, each rising not with defiance, but with quiet solidarity. It was not a protest. It was a recognition. It was a door open for those who had waited too long, for those who had buried too many brothers in soil foreign and domestic, and for those who had sat quietly as the weight of sacrifice was dismissed by people who'd never worn a uniform, never carried the dead, never saluted a coffin draped in stars. The man's words had not been loud, but they had echoed with history, with reverence, with a kind of gravity only the truth could carry. And so, when the old sailor refused to sit, others followed, not in chaos, but with solemn resolve. A woman near the center of the gallery rose next, her posture straight despite the tremor in her hands. Her blazer was modest, but the gold star pinned to her lapel blazed like a beacon. Her son had died in Mosul, and though she never spoke a word, her presence spoke volumes. Next was a Marine, no more than 30, his dress blues still sharp, boots polished, spine straightened by combat and principle. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was thunder enough. Then came a man in civilian clothes with a prosthetic leg, leaning against a cane wrapped in worn black tape. Then another, and another, until the entire back half of the courtroom was on its feet, not as a mob, but as a wall, unmoving, unwavering, and undeniably united. Judge Merrick stood behind his bench, the gavel clenched in one fist, confusion and irritation mounting in his features. He struck the wood 3 times in rapid succession, each crack loud but ineffective. "Sit down immediately," he barked. "This is a courtroom, not a protest. I will clear the gallery if I must." But the threat, like the gavel, had lost its power. No one moved. No one sat. They simply stood, men and women of different ages, different branches, different stories, joined now by the shared indignation of watching a man humiliated for carrying the memory of sacrifice on his chest. Sarah looked around, her eyes wide, filled with something between awe and emotion. Her hand remained on her son's shoulder, grounding him, steadying herself. She didn't rise. Not yet. But her breathing had changed, slower, deeper, as if, for the first time, she could feel the weight lifting, just a little. Reeve didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel them behind him, row after row of brothers and sisters in arms, strangers in blood, but not in burden. His jaw tightened, his grip still firm around the metal that now felt less like a memory and more like a flag rising against injustice. Merrick's voice cut again through the tension. "You will all sit down or be held in contempt. I will not tolerate this insubordination." But the words no longer held their edge. The room had changed, and power was no longer centered at the bench. It had shifted, slowly, steadily, into the people who had come only to observe, but had found something worth standing for. A bailiff stepped forward, clearly uneasy. He looked at the judge, then at the crowd, his hand resting on the holster of procedure, not violence. He did not move further. He did not speak. He simply waited, unsure of where his allegiance truly lay. The judge's gavel came down once more, less decisive this time. "This is your last warning," Merrick said, his voice cracking slightly with something between disbelief and desperation. "I am ordering you to return to your seats." But the people standing weren't looking for confrontation. They weren't breaking laws or hurling insults. They were standing in reverence for Reeve, for Danny McConnell, for every name engraved on cold stone walls and carried in quiet hearts. The judge saw disruption. They saw duty. Sarah finally stood, slowly, carefully, but with purpose. Her son stood with her, not because he understood the depth of the moment, but because he felt it. His small hand clutched hers as he looked up at Reeve, his eyes wide, his posture mimicking the quiet strength of the man he barely knew. The gallery said nothing, but their unity was louder than any protest. Merrick stood frozen, gavel lifted but useless, faced with a courtroom that had chosen remembrance over rules. The silence that had filled the courtroom in the wake of the standing gallery settled now like a blanket over burning embers, thick, hot, heavy with unspoken emotion. Every person on their feet stood without moving, a human monument to a shared truth too long ignored. Judge Merrick, face reddened and jaw clenched, clung to the edge of his bench as if authority alone could hold the walls of the courtroom together. His hand still hovered above the gavel, but the wood had lost its magic. It no longer commanded obedience. It simply echoed powerlessness. The bailiffs had not moved. The veterans did not flinch. And Sergeant Thomas Reeve remained seated, eyes straight ahead, body unshaken, still holding the folded medal in his gloved hand. The judge opened his mouth again, voice caught somewhere between legal warning and personal plea. But before he could speak, motion broke from the right-hand side of the gallery. A woman mid-40s, modest blouse, hair pinned neatly back, rose from her seat and took a single step forward. She held something pressed tightly to her chest, her arms trembling slightly as she approached the open aisle. Her steps were hesitant, unsure whether she was allowed to move, but something deeper than fear carried her forward. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, but she didn't sob. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, barely louder than a whisper, but it carried like a gunshot in the stunned quiet. "That man," she said, motioning to Reeve with her chin, "stood with my son the day he died." She took another step, this time firmer. "My son was in that same unit. Kandahar. He didn't come home." Her hands uncurled, and in them a photograph, worn, creased, cherished, was revealed. She held it up not to the judge, but to the room. It showed a young man in uniform, beaming with life, one arm draped over the shoulder of another soldier, Reeve. "That picture," she said, her voice now trembling, "was taken 2 days before he was killed. Sergeant Reeve was with him. He was the one who wrote me after, the only one. He didn't just send a letter. He came to my door. He told me the truth when the army gave me silence." A murmur passed through the crowd. Not dissent, not disruption, just breathing, hundreds of lungs expanding together, as if trying to draw on the grief that radiated from her words. "That medal," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every syllable, is all I have left of what they stood for. Not just my son, but all of them. That honor doesn't belong to the court. It belongs to the dead. And you," she turned now, slowly, deliberately toward Merrick, "you don't get to erase that." The judge recoiled as if slapped. He looked at the photograph, at the woman's trembling hands, then at the silent courtroom, all still standing, all watching. He tried to speak, but stumbled. His lips moved without words. This wasn't a legal argument. It wasn't a procedural motion. It was something he couldn't file or deny. It was truth, undressed and raw. The woman didn't move. She stood firm, tears still falling, her body rigid with emotion she had carried too long. Reeve slowly turned his head toward her, his expression unchanging, but his eyes shimmered, just barely. He hadn't known she would be there. He had delivered the letter. He had stood in her doorway and explained what he could not write. He remembered her tears then. He remembered promising that her son hadn't died alone. And now, here she was, standing for him when no one else had dared speak. Merrick finally found his voice, but it was thinner now, unsure. "This proceeding must return to order." His words fell flat. No one moved. Not one person sat. Another man in uniform stepped out of the row behind the woman, his chest decorated with campaign ribbons that marked him as a survivor of conflicts past. He didn't speak. He placed one hand gently on her shoulder. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. The unity had already been formed. This wasn't theater. It wasn't rebellion. It was mourning made visible. Merrick sat down, almost collapsing into his chair, sweat glistening on his forehead. His authority had not been taken from him. It had been relinquished by the weight of what he refused to understand. In that moment, the courtroom did not belong to the law. It belonged to memory, to the photo held high in trembling hands, to the metal Reeve still clutched, to every unreturned soldier whose story would never be filed. And for the first time since he'd ordered it removed, Merrick did not look at the medal as an ornament. He looked at it as something he could never carry, something he would never deserve. Judge Merrick sat frozen, the polished wood of his bench offering no refuge from the tidal shift unfolding before him. The woman with the photograph still stood with her arms trembling but steady, her grief crystallized into purpose. The gallery, packed with veterans, families, and strangers now unified by memory and conviction, had transformed from passive observers into silent sentinels of honor. And Thomas Reeve, though seated, had become the unspoken axis around which everything now turned. Merrick's face, flushed and slick with sweat, betrayed a man trying to summon control he no longer held. His authority had been challenged not by shouting or protest, but by truth spoken in calm voices, by dignity that refused to kneel. His hands fumbled toward his microphone, his voice rough as gravel. "Bailiffs," he barked, forcing a measure of command into the word. "Clear the gallery, immediately." The silence that followed that order was longer than any that had come before. The courtroom's two bailiffs, men in standard uniforms with years of courtroom discipline behind them, remained rooted in place. One glanced at the other. The second gave the barest shake of his head. No movement, no compliance. Just two men staring at a judge whose word had ceased to compel. Merrick's mouth opened again, but nothing came out. The refusal echoed louder than any shouted defiance could have. The court reporter, fingers still over her keyboard, paused. Her hands hovered, uncertain whether this moment even belonged in the record. The clerk, usually invisible in the proceedings, looked up from her notes, her face pale with discomfort but touched by something else. Understanding. Across the room, the woman who held the photograph finally lowered her arms. She did not return to her seat. She stood firm beside Reeve, beside every man and woman who had risen. Her act had opened a door that could no longer be closed. The courtroom was no longer responding to legal authority. It was answering to moral gravity. Slowly, Reeve stood. No dramatic flourish, no pointed glare. Just the slow, deliberate rise of a man who had carried weight heavier than the eyes of a courtroom. His uniform was still immaculate, every crease aligned, every stitch purposeful. The Medal of Honor remained in his gloved hand. He looked forward, not at Merrick, not at the gallery, but into the heart of the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but unmistakable, grounded in calm, not defiance. "Your Honor," he said, "you may control this courtroom, but you do not control sacrifice." He paused. "Let the words settle. Let the truth find its footing. That belongs to the dead, and to those of us who remember them." Merrick's jaw worked, his mouth opening to deliver some procedural rebuttal, but the words fell short of relevance. Nothing in his law books prepared him for this. No statute covered the refusal of a court to obey its own soul. Reeve continued, voice unwavering. "This medal wasn't pinned on me because I asked for it. It was earned in a place your rules don't reach. It's not a trophy. It's not a challenge to your authority. It's a promise. One I made when I carried Corporal McConnell's body back. One I kept when I visited his wife. One I wear for the brothers who don't have voices anymore." He looked briefly at the woman beside him, then back to the judge. "You wanted to silence me. I complied. I sat. I obeyed. But I will not be complicit in erasing them." The courtroom remained breathless. Merrick, now visibly shaking, reached again for his gavel. It hung in the air like a relic of a different time, a world where orders were followed without question. But this was not that world anymore, and the people standing before him had already lived in places where obedience had cost too much. One of the veterans near the back stepped into the aisle, removing his cover and placing it over his heart. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Around him, more followed, hats lifted, heads bowed, eyes forward. Not a protest, a remembrance. Merrick's hand fell from the gavel. He sat heavily, deflated not by resistance, but by irrelevance. His control had collapsed not in fury, but in silence, in restraint, in the simple, unstoppable truth that sacrifice does not answer to command. Reeve stood taller. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You may strip my words from the record," he said quietly, "but you will never strip the meaning from this medal." There was no applause, no cheers, just silence, deep, resonant, sacred. The kind of silence reserved for flag-draped caskets, for final salutes, for moments when the living remember what the law too often forgets. By the time the courtroom cleared that day, the silence that had overpowered the proceedings had already begun echoing far beyond the walls of that chamber. Someone no one could say exactly who had recorded the unfolding confrontation. The video opened with Judge Merrick ordering Sergeant Thomas Reeve to remove his Medal of Honor and captured every second of the standoff that followed. It showed the aging veteran standing in defense, the mother lifting a photo of her fallen son, the courtroom gallery rising in silent unison. It showed Merrick's commands falling flat, the bailiffs refusing to act, and finally, Reeve's composed defiance as he declared, "You may strip my words from the record, but you will never strip the meaning from this medal." That sentence, clipped from the footage and turned into a quote, became a symbol within hours. The video began circulating across social media platforms almost immediately. It was shared by military families, veteran organizations, news outlets, and influencers who recognized authenticity when they saw it. #HonorStands became the trending hashtag, joined by #ReeveStood and #MedalMeansMemory. What had begun as a local benefits dispute was no longer just about paperwork. It had ignited a national conversation about what the Medal of Honor represents, about bureaucratic arrogance, and about the cost of silence. Cable news picked up the story within 12 hours. Anchors replayed the video, sometimes with tears in their eyes, and invited retired generals, military historians, and veterans to speak about the sacredness of the medal. Gold Star parents appeared in interviews, many holding photos of their sons and daughters, recounting their own stories of sacrifice and remembrance. Everywhere the clip played, one moment struck the audience deepest, not when Merrick shouted, not even when the gallery stood, but when Reeve, dignified and silent, looked the judge in the eye and said those immortal words. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply declared a truth too powerful to suppress. Within 24 hours, petitions demanding Judge Merrick's resignation had gathered tens of thousands of signatures. By 48 hours, that number had surpassed 200,000. Veterans advocacy groups issued formal letters of condemnation. Some organized peaceful demonstrations outside the courthouse, not with signs, but with folded flags and silent salutes. People didn't want blood. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted dignity to mean something again. Merrick attempted to push back. Through his spokesperson, he released a statement insisting that courtroom decorum had been his only concern and that the Medal of Honor, while deeply respected, should not interfere with legal neutrality. But his words rang hollow in the face of what America had seen. No scandal could have exposed him more deeply than that moment of visible callousness. His failure hadn't been legal, it had been moral. Interviews with Reeve were requested from every major outlet, but he declined them all. He issued a single written statement. "I didn't stand to make a point. I stood to keep a promise. The medal doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the brothers I buried and the silence they left behind." That quote, printed on banners, t-shirts, and murals, became a kind of national prayer. At Arlington, footage showed dozens of visitors walking past the tomb of the unknown soldier, pausing just a little longer, hats held a little tighter, posture a little straighter. Across the country, stories began surfacing. Veterans recounting times they were told to keep their experiences quiet. Widows talking about benefit denials. Children holding medals they didn't yet understand but knew were important. What happened in that courtroom had become more than a viral clip. It had become a mirror. It reflected back what many feared was being forgotten. That sacrifice doesn't end with the funeral. That honor is not a performance. And that silence, while noble and mourning, must sometimes be broken to defend what matters most. Judge Merrick's name trended on social media for days, though not in celebration. Every time a statement was played on air, "This is a courtroom, not a protest," it was answered by footage of standing veterans, of that grieving mother, of Reeve standing tall with medal in hand. His record, once clean and respected, came under scrutiny. Old rulings were re-examined. Former clerks came forward with stories of procedural coldness. None of it was criminal, but all of it reinforced what had become glaringly obvious. The man who presided over a courtroom with such pride in process had forgotten the humanity the process was supposed to serve. By the end of the week, pressure from state officials, national figures, and even judicial review panels mounted. His ability to function as a neutral authority was gone. The court that had once been his domain was now the setting of his public undoing. Merrick issued his resignation with a brief letter citing health concerns and increasing distractions. No apology, no acknowledgement, but the silence he had once tried to command now spoke louder than any justification he could give. Thomas Reeve returned to Arlington not as a hero seeking praise, but as a soldier returning to duty. His steps resumed at the tomb, 21 forward, 21 back, each one a heartbeat for those no longer living. He did not speak of a courtroom. He did not wear the moment like a badge. But those who passed him, visitors, tourists, fellow guards, felt something different now, a reverence deeper than before, because they knew what he had endured to keep that silence sacred. As the uproar quieted and the headlines shifted, the world moved on, as it always does, from the fury of one moment to the distractions of the next. But within the solemn grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, time did not rush forward. It moved at its own sacred pace. The tomb of the unknown soldier remained untouched by controversy, its silence unbroken, its reverence unshaken. It was there, beneath the heavy gray sky and among rows of white markers, that Sergeant Thomas Reeve returned to his post. No cameras followed him. No news crews lined the cemetery gates. The viral fame that had engulfed him vanished the moment he stepped into the sacred threshold, replaced by the stillness that had always defined his calling. He wore his uniform with the same precision as before, every crease and brass detail spotless, his bearing unaltered by the storm that had nearly consumed him. What had happened in that courtroom? Every insult, every humiliation, every echo of injustice was left behind. Not forgotten, not forgiven, but released into the weight of the steps he took now with unwavering solemnity. 21 steps forward. Pause for 21 seconds. Turn. repeat. It was more than ritual. It was remembrance made visible. Each motion carried the weight of names never spoken aloud, of dog tags returned in silence, of folded flags handed to mothers who wept without sound. And for Reeve, each step was a promise renewed, that he would not let the memory of those lost be defined by paperwork or dismissed by protocol. He didn't walk for glory. He didn't march for medals. He walked because he knew that silence could hold a deeper truth than words ever could. There were visitors that day, families on spring break, older veterans in wheelchairs, schoolchildren clutching pamphlets filled with history they hadn't yet lived. Some of them recognized him, whispering to one another, pointing subtly, unsure if it was really him. But Reeve never acknowledged them. He never broke formation. His eyes fixed forward, body steady, commitment absolute. In the distance, an older man, perhaps a retired officer, saluted as Reeve passed. A woman wept quietly near the barrier, clutching the hand of her teenage son. The boy stood stiffly, trying to emulate the posture of the man they watched. And though Reeve said nothing, his presence said everything. That honor wasn't about headlines. That duty didn't waver under pressure. That some things are sacred, no matter who tries to diminish them. The world outside might spin with outrage, with division, with fleeting loyalties and louder voices. But here, in the heart of Arlington, truth moved slowly. And Reeve, now part of that truth, moved with it. He had not fought the judge with fire. He had not raised his voice. He had endured. And in enduring, he had exposed a failing far deeper than legal arrogance. He had shown that in the face of power, it is not anger that wins, it is principle. It is remembering that valor is not measured by applause, but by the willingness to stand firm when others bow. Back in the courtroom, Merrick's resignation left a hollow space in the bench he once commanded. The law would fill it, as it always did, with another face, another name, another voice trained in precedent and policy. But the wound he left behind couldn't be measured in rulings. It lived in the eyes of every veteran who watched the footage and felt their own dignity dismissed. It lingered in the whispers of families who carried grief in silence, who now saw that their pain had been made visible through one man's refusal to back down. Letters flooded Arlington over the next weeks. Handwritten notes, emails, a flag sent with folded corners, each accompanied by a simple message: "Thank you for standing." Reeve never answered them. He didn't need to. His answer was in every step. 21 forward, 21 back. Rain or shine, day or night. His silence, once mistaken for compliance, had become a message far louder than the judge's gavel could ever be. It said, "This is what honor looks like. This is what memory demands." It doesn't ask for attention. It asks for devotion. And sometimes, when injustice raises its voice, silence answers with something stronger than argument: resolve. One afternoon, as the sun broke through overcast skies and cast long shadows across the tomb, a group of young soldiers stood in a quiet line near the edge of the plaza. Their drill sergeant pointed to Reeve, still walking his line. "That," he said simply, "is why we wear the uniform right." No further explanation followed. None was needed, because what Thomas Reeve had done was not grandiose. It was not political. It was simply right. And in doing so, he reminded a nation that the highest form of protest is not chaos. It is composure. That dignity in the face of indignity is a battle most don't see, but some are brave enough to fight. And when Reeve paused at the end of his line, turned on his heel, and resumed his walk, the rhythm of his boots echoed across the stone, a sound more enduring than applause. A sound that told every soul listening that silence, when bound to purpose, can move the world. The end. If this story moved you, we'd love your support. Please consider subscribing to stay connected with more stories that honor truth, sacrifice, and courage. Your voice matters too. What did you think of the plot? Were there moments that hit home for you, or characters you felt deeply connected to? And where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We always read them.